Welcome to RAREST Retro Comics. In a previous episode, I went over the top 10 rarest Marvel comics from the 1970s. And when I mean rare, I kind of use that term loosely. I kind of refer to Marvel titles that are generally harder to find, specifically in high grade, compared to other Marvel titles in the 1970s. And I felt, well, this is also great to do with DC titles from the 1970s. DC in general in the 1970s started to have quite a big downturn in terms of circulation. And compared to Marvel, they're generally hard to find, period. Okay, let's jump right in. Coming in at number 10 are 100-page issues, or other DC giants from that time period. These are tougher to find in high grade, specifically the early issues of the first run, which is called DC 100-page Super Spectacular, but as they started to integrate these giants with the series, some of the later ones are not that difficult to find in high grade. This is issue number 6 that has a wonderful wraparound Neal Adams cover with the JLA. Number 4 is very difficult to find, and number 5 is extremely hard to find in high grade. This is also one of the tougher issues to find in high grade, and that's number 9, which is the Sergeant Rock issue, Our Army at War. In the 60s, they also published 80-page giants, and there was also a Sergeant Rock 80-page battle issue, which is a great issue. But the war stuff and the horror stuff of the 100-pagers are generally harder, as well as the romance, which I'm going to also show you a few examples later. DC was actually the first to publish these kind of Treasury editions in the earlier 1970s. Interestingly, something like this is actually not too difficult to find in high grade, but it's the later issues of these that were published in the mid and later 70s that are harder to find in high grade. But this and a few others deserve special mention just because they received a bit of notoriety with collectors in the collecting community, the comic book collecting community, because inside this main cover is a complete copy reproduction of Action Number 1. There are no differences other than the size. So what had happened is, some unscrupulous collectors or dealers, or even people unwittingly, sold a coverless copy essentially of this as Action Number 1. And if you didn't know, because Golden Age comic books are certainly larger than the comic books that are published in the 70s, then you could have been duped into thinking that you were buying an Action Number 1. So they had these famous first editions for Action 1, all the major first appearances of DC characters. So Action 1, Detective 27, Sensation 1, and I believe All-Star 3, and Batman 1, Superman 1, and they all had exact replicas of the comic book inside. That being said, the softcover version of this are fairly easy to find in high grade. However, they also published hardcover editions. I never owned a hardcover edition of this, and I don't even know if I've seen them at a show or at a store. So those are certainly a lot harder to find. But this is famous first edition, and they numbered these kind of weird. So this is like C26. I'm not even sure why they number them like that. But this is famous first edition C26, which reprints Action 1. I want to show you a couple other examples as well. In my opinion, the best DC Treasury you should look for is Superman versus Muhammad Ali. And this just has a lot of cultural significance for that time. And the other one I want to show that's kind of interesting is the Bible. And this is a adaptation of a few biblical stories by Joe Kubert. And the artwork is actually really quite interesting. But one of the more interesting DC Treasuries that they published. Coming in at number 8 are DC horror titles. This is a copy of House of Secrets number 90. It's got a wonderful cover by Neal Adams. The two, what I would call House of Horror titles, House of Secrets and House of Mystery, had some incredible covers in the 1970s. DC really knew what they were doing with their covers. And this is a copy of Weird War number 1. This is like a hybrid of horror and war, and amazingly, this series had legs. It lasted many, many issues. the earlier issues of Weird War can be very hard to locate in high grade, and it's now got a bit of a cult following. And actually, this first issue is actually quite expensive if you want to buy one in high grade. One of the underappreciated horror titles, in my opinion, is The Unexpected, and this has got a great gray tone cover by Neil Adams as well too. I would say DC titles, in terms of their stories and horror titles, were far better than Marvel. They actually created a lot of original stories. This is a copy of Witching Hour number 33, which has a fabulous witch cover with the really nice moon motif in the background. Tough to find in nice shape. Witching Hour had a lot of great covers by Nick Cardy. Coming in at number 7 are Western titles. DC was not as prolific as Marvel when it came to publishing Western titles. This is a copy of Johnny Thunder number 1, which just contains reprints. Tomahawk was a long-lasting title which started, I believe, in the 40s and ran right through the 60s and into the Bronze Age. Tomahawk became Son of Tomahawk later on. And, an interesting title that looked at some challenging issues of that time. This is a spectacular cover by Neil Adams, an all-star Western. This is probably one of my favorite Western covers, or even just covers of all time. This kind of gray tone, hang 'em high cover. In my collecting experience, when you go to comic book stores or comic book conventions, dealers generally don't have as many DC titles from this time period compared to Marvel. In the 1970s, DC started to see a sharp downturn in terms of the number of copies printed for all of their titles. So, in general, they're more difficult to find compared to their Marvel counterparts. DC also published just a ton of different, what I would call, oddball titles in the 1970s. Some are easy to find, some of them are a little more difficult, but I just want to do a special mention of one particular issue, and just to kind of show you some of the weird stuff that they published. And this is first issue special number 4, featuring Lady Cop. ComicTropes, if you're familiar with that channel, did a wonderful episode just on this particular issue, just because it's so bizarre. And, I think as a result of that episode, this issue gained some traction and is now actually kind of collectible just because it's just so weird. Coming in at number 6 are what I would call Whitman Variants. This one was kind of a tough one to figure out. What these are basically comic books that were bagged in packs of 3 that were typically distributed in department stores. Instead of paying the 40-cent cover price, what they would do is they would put them in bags of 3 and sell them for 99 cents. Some of these are pretty common. It's the later issues from the late 70s into the early 80s where these would become a lot more difficult to find. This is a copy of DC Comics Presents. And what's kind of tricky about these is that they don't have any numbers on the title. You don't know what the number is until you look inside the cover. They all have this little Whitman, and there's some variations of where the Whitman logo was placed. So I'll show you another example. This is another Whitman variant of Superman. And in this case, you can see the Whitman logo is placed over there, and it's also put out over there. So it seems the earlier bagged Whitman issues are easier to find, and the later ones are more rare. Some of them are very hard to find. There's actually one DC Comics Presents, which I'll show over here, that sells for hundreds of dollars just because it's so hard to find. And similar to the Marvel 30 and 35 cent variants, there are collectors who are looking to complete sets of these. But these Whitman variants are really hard to gauge in terms of how hard they are to find. Some of them are very easy, but some of them are very difficult. So that's why I kind of placed them at number 6. So number 5, I would say, are teen humor titles like Binky's Buddies. I don't have very many of these, and honestly, the ones I have are not even that high grade. But again, these are very, what I would call, Archie-esque titles in terms of their artwork. Binky's Buddies, A Date with Debbie, and Swing with Scooter. This is actually a 12 center, so this is technically a Silver Age book instead of a Bronze Age. But Swing with Scooter did last more than 19 issues, but I just kind of wanted to show you an example of these DC teen humor titles. I also wanted to show this issue of Welcome Back, Kotter #1, which I guess you can kind of classify or lump into that group. It was a very popular TV series in the 70s, and this series actually lasted quite a while, and this is the first issue. They had a few DC TV comics. You can look in the top left corner there. One is ISIS, and I believe they also use this logo on their Shazam title as well, too. Specifically, the later issues of this run, Welcome Back, Kotter, can be very hard to locate in nice shape. So after teen humor, what's scarier than that? Well, similar to Marvel, it's kids humor. DC did not publish a lot of titles that would qualify as what I would say as kids humor. Popular titles at that time like Casper the Friendly Ghost or Dennis the Menace, DC really didn't have too many titles like this. This is a really weird one. This is Laurel and Hardy #1, and essentially it's only a one-shot, a single issue. A tough book to find in high grade, but, kind of interesting. The big kids title that DC published was Sugar and Spike, and had great artwork by Sheldon Mayer. And even though sales of this title were low, they continued to publish them just to kind of like get their foot in the door with the kids market. Sugar and Spike, this title can actually be kind of expensive if you want to buy these in high grade, but again, very difficult to locate in true high grade. I mentioned these kind of giant size formats earlier, and this is an issue of Super DC Giant, which had the Three Musketeers, which is also kind of a kid's title. Maybe their attempt to kind of copy other like popular titles, Tom and Jerry or other Hanna-Barbera titles at that time. The Three Musketeers would actually end up getting their own series, and this is issue #2. And these books are just hard to locate. Again, titles like these don't have a lot of value or are not popular with collectors. To me, they're, when I come across stuff like this, especially in nice shape, I just like to pick them up because they're usually not that expensive, and they're just kind of fun to find. Coming in at #3 are DC Digests. DC actually did a pretty good job publishing these digest form comic books in the later 70s and early 80s to some success. These are really tough to find. This issue of Batman actually has a reprint of Batman #251, the classic Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams story featuring the Joker. One of the best, in my opinion, Bronze Age Batman stories. But yeah, these are pretty tough. Try finding a set of these. One of the most well-known characters that DC actually made a lot of comic books is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and this is a tougher digest to find, believe me. Strangely, they did a lot of Treasury Edition Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeers, and I used to have those, but they're long gone, unfortunately. And this one also has got great artwork by Sheldon Mayer. But there you go. DC Digests, very tough to locate in nice shape. There are a few oddball items that I also want to talk about that maybe don't fit into a particular category. Similar to like Marvel, that produced a kind of fanzine called Foom, DC also had one called The Amazing World of DC Comics. And this was a larger format magazine, and this was also available only through mail order. Tough to find, certainly, and the interior is really quite interesting, and actually probably deserves an episode by itself. This one has actually a wonderful black and white Jack Kirby unpublished story in the days of the mob. And these are definitely worth seeking out. So this is the first issue. I also have the second issue of The Amazing World of DC Comics. Coming in at #2 is DC Romance. DC actually published a lot of romance titles. This series of The Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love had some really amazing covers. This is a Grey Tone cover by Neil Adams. And these are quite hard to find in nice shape, and they can be quite pricey. This is a copy of Girls Romance number 158. Like I said, DC had many romance titles at this time, and some of them had just really interesting covers. The next one I'm going to show you here, this is another one of the examples of like really what I think great artwork for a cover, and this is Falling in Love number 121. Probably one of the best known artists for doing covers is J. Scott Pike. He's certainly famous for another young romance cover, which is number 150. He also did a number of other covers, and I think they're worthwhile looking after. As I showed earlier in this video, 100 pagers, there were a lot of 100 pages of young romance, and these are tough to find in grade. I think they have kind of hilarious covers. I mean, I was always picking up homeless animals, but this one wouldn't be tamed. And this is a copy of Young Love, number 107. When you read some of these panels, they're kind of funny. Like you have like the mother. His mother thought he wasn't my kind of man, or too beautiful, too young, my mother, my rival. And what is the most rarest DC comic book from the 1970s? Well, this one isn't even close. So what happened in 1978, DC was facing a lot of difficult choices. Their plan to expand and compete with Marvel by publishing and flooding the market with all these titles was failing, and they were just losing a lot of money. So they had to make a lot of tough choices. And one of the tough choices they had to make were to cancel numerous titles. And in 1978, the number of titles that they ended up canceling totaled around 30. Like, if you can imagine that I think at that time that was probably more than half of their titles that they lost in a period of 2 years. Now, some of the titles were kind of due to finish, but others were canceled outright just because, well, they weren't making any money, and they were actually bleeding a lot of money. So what DC did was they actually published 2 issues of what's called Canceled Comic Cavalcade. These 2 issues were not available for sale to the public. Actually, they only printed 35 copies of each of these 2 issues, and they circulated them within the office, mostly to like the creators who were involved in these comic books. So what these comic books contained were like the last remnants of issues that were scheduled to be published, but they ended up being canceled. So titles like Black Lightning, Shade the Changing Man, I think like Claw the Unconquered. These, to me, like these 2 issues or comics have kind of reached this kind of mythical status. They rarely exchange hands, but Bronze and Modern Gods did a wonderful interview with Paul Levitz, who was working at DC at that time, and they talked in depth about these particular 2 comic books, and definitely worth checking out. Canceled Comic Cavalcade. These 2 issues were printed just to kind of retain copyright records or copyright for the remainder of these issues. So there you go. The rarest DC comic book from the 1970s, Canceled Comic Cavalcade. Thanks for watching. The previous Marvel episode about the 10 rarest Marvel comic books, I got a lot of great feedback and comments. And there was certainly a lot of stuff that I learned as well about different oddball titles and comic books from Marvel that I didn't even mention in that video. And I'm sure in this video, there's a lot of DC stuff that I'm probably missing. And it's just because, well, you know, I do like Marvel and DC comic books, but I was certainly a more Marvel-centric collector. And as time went on, I started to pick up DC titles. But my DC knowledge, while, you know, still probably reasonable, is nowhere near as deep as my Marvel knowledge. I hope you found this video just as interesting as the Marvel one, and that it may encourage you to seek out some of these interesting, obscure comic books from the 1970s. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And until next time, enjoy and read your comic books.